Have you ever wondered how a small group of farmers, living among the hills beside a quiet river, managed to build an empire that ruled most of the known world? It began, as all great things do, in simplicity. A few settlements scattered along the Tiber River in central Italy. No one looking at those muddy huts and wooden fences could have imagined that they would one day command legions, build marble cities, and shape the laws and languages of continents. In the beginning, Rome was not yet an empire, nor even a republic. It was a kingdom, small, superstitious, and deeply tied to myth. The Romans told stories about their origin not as historians, but as poets. They said that their city had been founded in 753 BCE by twin brothers, Romulus and Remus, who were suckled by a she-wolf after being abandoned as infants. The tale is dramatic, but its meaning is clear. Rome was born from survival, from defiance, from the will to live. Romulus, the story goes, became the first king after killing his brother. A tragic symbol that power, even at the beginning, demanded sacrifice. Under those early kings, Rome learned the arts of organization and religion. They built walls, drained marshes, and established the Senate, a council of elders who would one day grow powerful enough to challenge kings themselves. When the last king, Tarquin the Proud, was overthrown around 509 BCE, the Romans vowed never again to be ruled by a monarch. In his place, they created the Roman Republic, a new experiment in governance that blended monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy. It was a delicate balance. Two consuls held power for only 1 year, the Senate advised them, and assemblies of citizens voted on laws. It was not equality as we know it. Slaves and women had no political voice. But for its time, it was revolutionary. Rome's government relied on debate, persuasion, and compromise. And this habit of negotiation, this ability to adapt and reorganize, would become one of the empire's most enduring strengths. The early republic was surrounded by enemies. The Italian peninsula was filled with tribes and rival cities, the Etruscans to the north, the Samnites in the mountains, and the Greek colonies in the south. Through centuries of war and alliance, Rome learned discipline. Each defeat became a lesson, each victory a foundation. By the 3rd century BCE, Rome had united most of Italy. Its legions, citizen soldiers bound by duty and trained with precision, became the most formidable military machine of the ancient world. Their success was not just due to strength, but to structure. The Roman army could rebuild itself after disaster, adapt its tactics, and even absorb the strengths of its enemies. And then, across the sea, they met their greatest rival, Carthage, a wealthy maritime power in North Africa. The struggle between Rome and Carthage would become known as the Punic Wars. 3 great conflicts that lasted more than 100 years and determined who would dominate the Mediterranean. The second of these wars produced one of history's most extraordinary figures, Hannibal Barca. In 218 BCE, he led an army, including war elephants, across the Alps to invade Italy from the north. It was a feat so daring that it still inspires awe today. For nearly 2 decades, Hannibal terrorized Roman armies, winning victory after victory at Trebia, Trasimene, and Cannae, where nearly 50,000 Romans fell in a single day. Yet Rome did not surrender. That was the nature of the Republic, resilient, stubborn, relentless. The Senate raised new armies, even as the city's population dwindled. Eventually, the Roman general Scipio Africanus took the fight to Carthage itself and defeated Hannibal at the Battle of Zama in 202 BCE. Carthage was humbled, and Rome became the unchallenged power of the Western Mediterranean. The world began to change. After Carthage's defeat, Rome turned eastward, toward the wealthy kingdoms of Greece, Egypt, and Asia Minor. Conquest brought riches, gold, art, slaves, and luxury. But it also brought tension. As wealth poured in, inequality grew. Farmers lost their land to estates owned by the elite. The Senate grew more corrupt, generals more ambitious. It was in this atmosphere of success and strain that the Republic began to unravel. The very system designed to prevent tyranny was cracking under the weight of empire. Yet even as politics darkened, culture flourished. Greek philosophy merged with Roman practicality, creating a civilization that valued both intellect and discipline. Latin literature began to emerge, with poets, historians, and orators shaping the language that would one day become the root of many modern tongues. Rome had conquered the world, but in doing so, it began to lose control of itself. And as night slowly falls over the ancient city, the sound of merchants fading, the torches flickering on marble columns, we can almost hear the restless hum of ambition beneath its streets. The Republic was powerful, but it was also fragile. It was about to face a century of chaos, civil wars, dictators, and the slow, dramatic transformation from democracy to empire. The story of that transformation, of how Rome went from a republic of citizens to the empire of emperors, is the story that follows. As Rome expanded, victory brought not peace, but unease. Success can be its own kind of poison. The republic that had once prided itself on discipline and virtue was now swollen with wealth and ambition. Generals returned from campaigns with fortunes and private armies, while the poor filled the streets of Rome, jobless and hungry, watching the glittering palaces of the elite rise above them. The ideals that had built Rome, modesty, civic duty, simplicity, began to fade. In their place grew greed, rivalry, and corruption. The Senate, once the moral compass of the state, became a theater of personal power. Elections were bought, promises were traded, and violence became a language of politics. It is easy, looking back, to think of Rome as inevitable, but at this point, its future was far from certain. In the 2nd century before Christ, two brothers, Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, tried to save the Republic by redistributing land to the poor. Their reforms were modest, even moral, but they challenged the Senate's authority. Both men were murdered. Their deaths marked a turning point, a sign that political disagreement in Rome had begun to dissolve into bloodshed. As decades passed, generals began to wield more power than the Senate itself. The loyalty of soldiers shifted, no longer to the Republic, but to their commanders, who could promise them land and wealth. One of the first to realize this was Gaius Marius, a brilliant military reformer. He opened the army to the poor, creating a professional force whose devotion lay with him, not with the state. His rival, Lucius Cornelius Sulla, did the same. And when their ambitions clashed, Rome descended into civil war. For the first time, Roman legions marched on their own city. Sulla seized power, declared himself dictator, and filled the streets with executions. He ruled with terror, but his tyranny carried an unintended lesson. Once one man could seize control, others would try to do the same. Out of that turbulence emerged new figures, men of charisma, intellect, and ruthless will. Among them was Julius Caesar. Caesar was born into an old but declining patrician family. He was ambitious, clever, and utterly fearless. His early life reads like a series of tests designed to shape a legend. Capture by pirates, escape from political enemies, ascent through the ranks of public office. He knew how to charm the people, how to outmaneuver rivals, and how to make power look like destiny. In 60 BCE, he formed an alliance with two other powerful men, Pompey the Great, a celebrated general, and Crassus, the richest man in Rome. This informal coalition became known as the First Triumvirate. Together, they ruled behind the scenes, dividing influence and territory. But alliances built on ambition never last. Caesar was given command of Gaul, modern France, and within a decade, he transformed it from a frontier into a Roman province. His campaigns there were brutal and brilliant. He crossed rivers, stormed fortresses, and subdued entire tribes. Millions of people came under Roman control, and Caesar's legions adored him. He wrote detailed commentaries on his conquests, written in clear, simple Latin, that made him both a military hero and a literary master. But while Caesar gained glory in Gaul, his rivals grew uneasy. The Senate, influenced by Pompey, ordered him to disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen. To obey meant humiliation. To disobey meant war. In January of 49 BCE, Caesar made his choice. He crossed the Rubicon River, a small stream that marked the legal boundary of his command, and marched on Rome. By doing so, he committed treason in the name of principle. According to legend, as he crossed, he uttered the words, "The die is cast." Civil war followed, swift and decisive. Caesar defeated Pompey's forces in Greece and Egypt. He met Cleopatra, Queen of the Nile, whose intelligence and political acumen matched his own. Together, they formed an alliance, personal and strategic, that symbolized Rome's growing entanglement with the wider world. When Caesar returned to Rome, he was a hero, but also a dictator. He introduced reforms, reorganizing debts, reforming the calendar, expanding citizenship. His vision was grand, perhaps even benevolent. But the Senate saw in him the shadow of a king, the very thing Rome had sworn to destroy centuries earlier. And so, on the Ides of March, 44 BCE, as he entered the Senate, he was surrounded by conspirators. Among them was Brutus, a man Caesar loved like a son. They struck swiftly. 23 wounds ended the life of the man who had conquered half the known world. His death was meant to save the Republic. Instead, it destroyed it. Chaos followed. The conspirators hoped for liberty, but what they unleashed was vengeance. Caesar's allies, led by Mark Antony and his adopted heir, Octavian, rallied the masses. Rome plunged into another cycle of war, the last and bloodiest of the Republic. At first, Antony and Octavian shared power, along with Lepidus, in what historians call the Second Triumvirate. They divided the Roman world between them, hunting down Caesar's killers with merciless efficiency. But power, once again, bred envy. Antony drifted east to Egypt, where he fell under Cleopatra's influence. Octavian, ruling from Rome, painted their love affair as treason, the story of a Roman hero seduced by a foreign queen. The final act came at the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE. Octavian's forces crushed Antony and Cleopatra's fleet. The lovers fled to Egypt and, facing defeat, took their own lives. Octavian returned to Rome as the unchallenged master of the world. But he was careful. He did not call himself king. Instead, he took the title princeps, first citizen. Later, he became known as Augustus. Under Augustus, Rome entered a new era, the age of emperors. The Republic was gone, But in its place stood something extraordinary, a stable, organized empire that would endure for nearly 500 years. It was a transformation that changed not only politics, but human history itself. For the first time, vast lands from Britain to Syria were united under one rule, one law, one currency, and, most remarkably, one vision of order. As the city's marble gleamed in the Mediterranean sun, Augustus famously said, "I found Rome a city of bricks and left it a city of marble." He was right, not only in stone, but in spirit. Rome had remade itself, just as it always did, evolving, surviving, expanding. And as the empire rose, it began to ask a new question. Not how to win the world, but how to keep it. When Augustus became the first emperor of Rome, he understood something that few conquerors ever learn. That power must be disguised as service, and control must look like peace. He spoke softly, avoided crowns, and claimed only to restore the republic. But behind that mask of modesty, he built a new order, a system so balanced, so carefully arranged, that it would hold the ancient world together for centuries. He kept the old institutions, the Senate, the magistrates, the assemblies. But their power was only symbolic now. Real authority flowed through Augustus himself. Commander of the armies, guardian of the treasury, protector of the people. His genius lay in subtlety. He did not destroy the republic, he embalmed it, preserving its image while filling it with imperial life. Rome, weary of war and chaos, welcomed him. After decades of bloodshed, the people longed for stability. Under his rule began what poets would later call the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, a period of relative calm and prosperity that lasted more than 200 years. For the first time in living memory, roads were safe, borders were secure, and trade moved freely across continents. Ships carried grain from Egypt to feed the capital. Merchants sold silk from China and spices from India. Travelers could journey from the forests of Gaul to the deserts of Arabia under the same laws, protected by the same legions. It was, in many ways, the first globalization, a vast network of roads, ports, and cities united by Roman order. The empire became a mirror of the world, reflecting its cultures, its contradictions, and its dreams. Augustus also reshaped the heart of Rome itself. He built temples, theaters, and monuments, not merely as displays of wealth, but as symbols of continuity. The Ara Pacis, the altar of peace, celebrated not conquest, but harmony. He encouraged literature and art that glorified Roman virtues, loyalty, courage, duty. Under his patronage, poets like Virgil, Horace, and Ovid flourished. Virgil's Aeneid, in particular, became the mythic foundation of the empire. The story of Aeneas, a Trojan hero who fled the ruins of Troy to found a new destiny in Italy. Through that poem, Augustus transformed myth into propaganda. Rome was not just powerful. It was chosen by fate. But even golden ages carry shadows. The peace Augustus built was sustained by discipline, by legions at the borders and spies in the streets. Freedom, once the soul of the republic, gave way to obedience. The people traded liberty for stability, and few regretted the exchange. When Augustus died in 14 CE, after ruling for 40 years, Rome mourned him as a father. His stepson, Tiberius, inherited a system so well crafted that it seemed eternal. But no system, however perfect, can escape the flaws of human nature. Tiberius was cautious, intelligent, but distant, a man burdened by suspicion. He withdrew from the capital, ruling from the island of Capri, surrounded by secrecy. Under him, the Senate grew fearful. Informers multiplied, and executions became common. The empire was stable, but the air was heavy. After Tiberius came Caligula, young, charismatic, and deeply unbalanced. At first he was adored. He granted amnesty to prisoners, gave bonuses to soldiers, and threw lavish games for the people. But soon, his behavior grew erratic, then cruel. Ancient sources describe him declaring himself a god, building temples to his own divinity, and ordering the execution of anyone who displeased him. Whether all these tales are true or exaggerated, they reveal something important. The emperor was no longer a man of state. He was the state itself. Caligula's reign ended in assassination, a pattern that would repeat often in Rome's history. His uncle, Claudius, was found trembling behind a curtain in the palace and proclaimed emperor by the soldiers. Claudius, once considered weak and foolish because of his limp and stutter, surprised everyone. He proved to be capable, curious, and efficient. He expanded the empire into Britain, reformed the bureaucracy, and strengthened the justice system. Yet his personal life was turbulent. His marriages were political, his court full of intrigue. His final wife, Agrippina, maneuvered her son Nero into succession. And when Claudius conveniently died, rumor whispered of poison. Nero's early reign began with promise. He was young, artistic, and advised by wise men like Seneca. He supported the arts, reduced taxes, and seemed to embody a new generation of leadership. But as time passed, his darker impulses emerged. He craved adoration and feared betrayal. When a massive fire destroyed much of Rome in 64 CE, rumors spread that Nero himself had ordered it, though historians debate this. To divert blame, he accused the small but growing sect of Christians, ordering brutal persecutions that would haunt the empire's conscience for centuries. Nero rebuilt the city with grand avenues and marble palaces, most notably the Domus Aurea, the Golden House, a vast, glittering complex with gardens, artificial lakes, and walls covered in gold leaf. The people admired its beauty, but they saw too what it represented: the vanity of a ruler who saw the empire as his stage. Eventually, rebellion rose in the provinces. The legions that had once cheered Nero now turned against him. Cornered and abandoned, he took his own life in 68 CE, whispering, "What an artist dies in me." With those words, the line of Augustus ended. Rome was without an emperor. Chaos returned. A year of 4 emperors followed, each claiming power, each falling in turn. The empire teetered, its strength tested once more. And then came a soldier, practical, disciplined, unpretentious. His name was Vespasian. He restored order, repaired finances, and began a new dynasty, the Flavian. His son Titus would complete the Colosseum, the great amphitheater that still stands today, a monument both to Roman grandeur and to its contradictions. The Colosseum was a marvel of engineering. Seating tens of thousands, it hosted games, mock naval battles, and gladiatorial contests. To modern eyes, it is a symbol of art and architecture. To the ancients, it was a reflection of their world, brutal, spectacular, communal. For the Romans, entertainment was a kind of ritual. The empire offered bread and circuses, food and spectacle, to keep its people content. Beneath that balance of power and pleasure, however, the machinery of empire turned ceaselessly. Legions guarding borders, slaves building cities, merchants carrying the lifeblood of trade. Rome had reached a height unimaginable to its founders. Its borders stretched from the misty isles of Britain to the sands of Arabia, from the Atlantic coast to the Euphrates River. Over 70 million people lived under its laws, speaking many languages, worshipping many gods, yet all, in some way, Roman. It was a triumph of order over chaos, but it carried within it the seeds of its own fragility. For empires, like all living things, grow weary with age. And as the first century turned into the second, Rome stood at its zenith, rich, confident, magnificent. The emperors who followed, men like Trajan, Hadrian, and Marcus Aurelius, would guide it through its golden age, building monuments and philosophies that still shape us today. But the higher Rome rose, the more it would have to lose. After the chaos that followed Nero's death, the empire found a new rhythm. The Flavian emperors had restored order, rebuilt confidence, and left behind a city that gleamed once more with marble and power. By the end of the first century, Rome stood stronger than ever. Yet it was the next generation that would bring the empire to its greatest height. A century of prosperity, learning, and relative peace. Historians would later call it the age of the 5 good emperors. The first of them was Nerva, an older statesman who ruled briefly but wisely. His greatest act was not one of conquest or reform, but of succession. He adopted as his heir a general named Trajan, setting a precedent that the throne could be passed not by blood, but by merit. It was a quiet revolution, one that ensured stability through choice rather than chance. When Trajan became emperor in the year 98, he embodied the Roman virtues of discipline, modesty, and strength. He was not born in Italy, but in Spain, a sign of how far Roman identity had spread. Under his command, the empire reached its maximum territorial extent. His armies marched north into Dacia, a land of forests and mountains, modern Romania, and conquered it after fierce resistance. The victory was immortalized in Trajan's column, a spiraling stone narrative carved with thousands of figures, depicting every battle and bridge, every camp and triumph. From the Rhine to the Tigris, Roman standards fluttered over distant horizons. For a brief moment, it seemed as if there were no limits left to conquer. Yet Trajan, despite his successes, was not a tyrant of war. He cared for infrastructure and welfare, building aqueducts, roads, and markets. He created the Alimenta, a public fund that supported poor children throughout Italy, perhaps one of the earliest examples of social policy in history. When he died in 117 CE, the empire was vast but stretched thin. His successor, Hadrian, understood that expansion had reached its limit. The empire, he believed, must be strengthened, not extended. So he changed Rome's course, from conquest to consolidation. Hadrian was a philosopher as much as a ruler, a man of deep curiosity and restless mind. He traveled more than any emperor before him, visiting every province of his empire, inspecting fortresses, meeting citizens, studying cultures. Where Trajan had pushed borders outward, Hadrian built walls to hold them firm. The most famous of these was Hadrian's Wall in Britain, a line of stone and turf stretching across the width of the island, separating Roman civilization from the untamed lands beyond. It was both a boundary and a symbol, the edge of the known world, where empire met wilderness. Hadrian's reign was also marked by art and architecture. He rebuilt the Pantheon, whose vast dome still astonishes the eye, a perfect circle open to the sky, He founded cities, restored temples, and filled the empire with beauty. Yet his reign was not without sorrow. He suffered from the loss of his beloved companion, Antinous, who drowned in the Nile. In his grief, Hadrian deified him, founding cities in his name and spreading his image across the empire. To modernize, it may seem strange, but it reveals something profound about Rome. That love, too, could be immortalized in marble. After Hadrian came Antoninus Pius, a ruler whose name itself means the dutiful. His reign, peaceful and prosperous, is one of the least eventful in Roman history, and that, perhaps, is its greatest achievement. He governed without cruelty, ruled without ambition, and died without scandal. Under him, the empire was at ease, a rare harmony between power and restraint. His adopted son, Marcus Aurelius, would be the last of the 5 good emperors, and perhaps the most remarkable. Marcus was not born for the throne. He was born for philosophy. From a young age, he was drawn to the teachings of the Stoics, those who believed that virtue and reason were the true foundations of happiness. As emperor, he carried that philosophy with him, through war, disease, and loss. He wrote his thoughts in a small notebook, never meant for others to read. Those notes would one day become one of the most beloved books of wisdom in the world. The Meditations. In it, he speaks to himself, gently, reminding his own soul to remain calm amidst chaos, to see beauty in impermanence, to meet cruelty with understanding. You have power over your mind, he wrote, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. It is a strange thing to imagine, the most powerful man in the world, writing to himself as if he were only a student of life. But that humility was his greatness. He led armies on the northern frontier against fierce tribes, even as plagues ravaged the empire. He endured betrayal, fatigue, and grief, yet never lost his composure. Under Marcus Aurelius, the empire remained vast and stable. But cracks were beginning to form. The frontiers were under constant pressure, the treasury strained by war, and succession, that delicate Roman problem, once again became uncertain. His son Commodus was nothing like his father. Where Marcus was disciplined, Commodus was indulgent. Where Marcus sought wisdom, Commodus sought pleasure. When Marcus died in 180 CE, the golden age of Rome died with him. The philosopher's calm gave way to the chaos of the next century, an age of decadence, intrigue, and decline. But for a moment, during those years of the 5 good emperors, the world had seen something rare. An empire not ruled by fear, but by order, balance, and thought. Roads stretched like veins across continents, carrying letters, ideas, and goods. Roman law, written and reasoned, brought a sense of justice even to distant provinces. Cities flourished with theaters and baths, aqueducts and forums. If you could have walked through a Roman town then, perhaps in Gaul or Hispania or along the coast of North Africa, you would have seen a familiar rhythm. The market square buzzing with voices in many tongues, children reciting lessons, soldiers drilling in the morning sun, and in the evening, lamps glowing along marble streets. It was, in a sense, the first truly connected world. A network of humanity held together by roads and rules, ambition and architecture. And though centuries have passed, traces of it remain everywhere. In our languages, our laws, our cities, even in the calendar that marks our days. Rome at its height was not just a place. It was an idea. That order could be made from chaos, that civilization could span oceans and endure beyond death. But even the greatest lights cast shadows. Soon, new challenges would rise: invasions, corruption, plagues, and the slow erosion of faith in the old gods. The empire, vast as it was, would begin to strain under its own weight. And as the night deepens over the marble city, we begin to hear the faint echo of a question that would haunt Rome for centuries to come. How does an empire die? When Marcus Aurelius closed his eyes for the last time in the year 180 CE, the empire stood at its greatest size, but its foundation had begun to tremble. He left behind his son, Commodus, a young man who had grown up in the shadow of philosophy, yet cared nothing for its lessons. Commodus saw not a world to protect, but a stage to rule. He dressed as Hercules, fought in the arena, and renamed Rome itself the Colonia Commodiana, the colony of Commodus. The Senate despised him, the people mocked him, and the Praetorian Guard, the elite soldiers who protected the emperor, finally turned against him. One night, they strangled him in his bath. His death ended the line of the Antonines, and with it, the fragile peace of the empire. What followed was chaos. In a single year, 193 CE, 5 men claimed the throne. The Senate, the army, and the provinces each backed their own candidates. Power was no longer decided by law or succession, but by the sword. The victor was Septimius Severus, a general from North Africa. He was strong, pragmatic, and ruthless. He ruled through the army, doubling their pay and ensuring their loyalty. Under him, the empire expanded again into Mesopotamia. But at a cost, the state's finances began to crumble. The soldiers' loyalty had to be bought, and every new emperor would have to pay more. Severus's last advice to his sons was simple: be harmonious, enrich the soldiers, and despise everyone else. It was advice that revealed the truth of Rome's decline, that the army, once a servant of the state, had become its master. His sons, Caracalla and Geta, ruled briefly together before Caracalla had his brother murdered. To win the support of the common people, he extended Roman citizenship to all free men in the empire, a gesture that seemed noble, but was partly a way to collect more taxes. Caracalla was eventually killed by one of his own guards while on campaign. After his death, emperors came and went in rapid succession, each rising from the legions, each falling by violence or betrayal. Some ruled for years, others for weeks. It was a century of emperors and usurpers, of coins struck with names that few could remember. The empire was vast but unstable. Borders were under constant attack. Germanic tribes pressed against the Rhine and Danube. Persian kings challenged Rome in the east. In the interior, plagues swept through the population, and inflation devoured the economy. A silver coin that once bought a meal now bought nothing but dust. Yet amid the darkness, there were flashes of brilliance. The Emperor Aurelian, a soldier of humble birth, reunited the fractured empire in the late 3rd century. For years, the provinces had broken away. In Gaul, in Egypt, even in the east, where Queen Zenobia of Palmyra ruled her own realm. Aurelian defeated them all, earning the title Restitutor Orbis, restorer of the world. He built new walls around Rome, the Aurelian walls that still stand today, massive stone ramparts encircling the eternal city. They were not just a defense, but a confession that even Rome itself now needed protection. During these years of crisis, something else was changing. Quietly, almost invisibly at first. The old gods of Rome once worshipped with pride and ceremony, began to lose their hold. Temples still stood, but belief was fading. People sought meaning elsewhere, in mystery cults, in astrology, in personal faiths that promised salvation rather than glory. One of those faiths began as a small, persecuted sect, the followers of Jesus of Nazareth. At first, they were dismissed as troublemakers, even criminals. Nero had blamed them for the Great Fire. Later emperors viewed them with suspicion because they refused to worship the emperor as divine. But persecution only made them stronger. By the 3rd century, Christian communities existed across the empire, in Rome, Alexandria, Antioch, and beyond. Their faith spread not by conquest, but by quiet conviction, by acts of kindness, by words of hope whispered in marketplaces and catacombs. They spoke of love over power, humility over pride, ideas that cut to the heart of Roman ambition. As the empire's outer strength faltered, its inner life began to shift. The old Roman virtues, discipline, honor, duty, seemed less certain in a world of war and famine. Philosophy, too, changed tone. Stoicism, once the creed of emperors, now sounded austere and distant. People longed for comfort, for meaning beyond this life. It was a slow revolution, not of armies, but of souls. Meanwhile, the machinery of empire continued to grind on. Diocletian, rising from humble origins, took power in 284 CE and reshaped the Roman world entirely. He realized that the empire was too large for one man to rule. So he divided it into 2 halves, East and West, each with its own emperor. Beneath them, he appointed co-rulers called Caesars, creating what he called the Tetrarchy, the rule of 4. It was a bold experiment in administration, designed to prevent civil war and strengthen the frontiers. For a time, it worked. Diocletian reformed taxes, stabilized the currency, and imposed strict controls on the economy. But he also demanded unity of faith. To him, the old gods were essential to Rome's identity, and Christianity was a threat. In 303 CE, he launched the most severe persecution in Roman history. Churches were destroyed, scriptures burned, believers imprisoned and executed. Yet even this failed to stamp out the new religion. It survived underground, resilient and defiant, sustained by the very suffering meant to destroy it. And then, in a twist that would change the world forever, a new emperor rose from the ranks of the army, a man named Constantine. Constantine was a soldier and a statesman, but above all, a visionary. In 312 CE, before a crucial battle near Rome, he claimed to have seen a sign in the sky, a cross of light, and the words, "In this sign, conquer." He ordered his soldiers to mark their shields with the Christian symbol, and he won the battle. Whether miracle or myth, that vision transformed history. The following year, he issued the Edict of Milan, granting freedom of religion to Christians across the empire. What had once been a crime now became a faith favored by the throne. Constantine himself converted before his death, becoming the first Christian emperor. He built great churches, including the original St. Peter's in Rome, and founded a new capital in the east, Constantinople, the New Rome. With that act, the balance of the world shifted eastward. Power, once centered on the Tiber, now flowed to the shores of the Bosporus. And Christianity, once hunted, now began its ascent. From catacombs to cathedrals, from whispered prayers to imperial decrees. Rome had been born of iron and discipline. Now it was remade in faith and spirit. But in gaining a new soul, it had also lost part of its old one. The empire that had once worshipped Jupiter and Mars now knelt before the cross. The transformation was total. Political, spiritual, and cultural. The ancient world was ending, though few yet realized it. The legions still guarded the frontiers. The forums still bustled with trade. The baths still steamed, and the amphitheaters still echoed with cheers. But beneath the surface, the old order was fading. The laws, the economy, even the language of empire would soon begin to change. For centuries, Rome had believed it was eternal. And yet, nothing made by human hands can last forever. But endings, like beginnings, rarely come all at once. They arrive slowly, like twilight, a gradual dimming of light that feels almost peaceful. After Constantine's reign, the Roman world entered its final, fragile centuries. His vision had united the empire under a new faith, but his death in 337 left behind not unity, but division. His sons, each eager for power, turned against one another in civil war. Brothers killed brothers, cousins betrayed cousins, and by the time the bloodshed ended, the empire had once again split apart into eastern and western halves that would never truly reunite. In the east, Constantinople gleamed, a new Rome rising from the sea, guarded by walls of stone and faith. It was a city of domes and mosaics, of scholars and merchants, bridging Europe and Asia. In the west, the old capital on the Tiber began to fade. Its population shrank, its grandeur dimmed, its senators clung to memories of a past that no longer existed. But the Roman idea, that strange, persistent belief in law, order, and civilization, still held the empire together. For a while. Throughout the 4th century, emperors struggled to defend the frontiers. Beyond the Rhine and Danube, entire peoples were on the move. Goths, Vandals, Franks, Lombards, Huns, driven by famine, by war, or by the restless push of other tribes from the depths of Eurasia. To the Romans, these migrations seemed like invasions, but in truth they were tides. Great human currents seeking safety, land, and stability. Some came as allies, others as conquerors. And the line between the two blurred with every passing decade. In 376 CE, one of these tribes, the Visigoths, asked permission to cross the Danube and settle within the empire. The Romans agreed, but mistreated them, starving and extorting them. Desperation turned to anger, and soon, rebellion. 2 years later, at the Battle of Adrianople, the Gothic cavalry shattered the Roman legions. Emperor Valens was killed, his body never found. That defeat was more than a military disaster. It was a psychological one. The Romans, who had believed themselves invincible for 800 years, had been humbled by what they still called barbarians. The walls of the empire suddenly felt less secure, the roads less certain. Over the next century, the Western Empire became a patchwork of alliances and emergencies. Emperors rose and fell at dizzying speed, each ruling over less than the one before him. The army was filled with foreign recruits, loyal not to Rome, but to their commanders. The treasury was empty, the bureaucracy decayed, the old aristocracy more concerned with estates than with the state. And through all this, Christianity grew, not just as faith, but as structure. The church became the moral spine of a weakening world. Bishops replaced governors, monasteries replaced forums as centers of learning and order. The empire that had once crucified Jesus now carried his symbol on every banner. In 410 CE, the unthinkable happened. The Visigoths, under their leader Alaric, marched on Rome itself. They surrounded the city, cutting off its food and water. The Senate tried to negotiate. The people starved. And then, for the first time in nearly 8 centuries, the Eternal City fell to a foreign army. The sack of Rome lasted 3 days. Churches were spared, but homes and palaces were looted. Women wept in the streets, and men who once ruled provinces now begged for mercy. When Alaric and his army finally withdrew, they left behind silence and a wound that would never heal. Saint Jerome, writing from faraway Bethlehem, captured the shock of the world. The city which had taken the whole world is itself taken. And yet, Rome did not die that day. Its people rebuilt, its churches reopened, its bells rang again. But something had changed forever. Over the next decades, new powers carved up the Western Empire. The Vandals crossed into North Africa, founding a kingdom in Carthage. The Franks settled in Gaul, the Visigoths in Spain, the Ostrogoths in Italy. Each adopted parts of Roman culture, its laws, its architecture, even its language. But the empire, as it had been, was gone. Meanwhile, the Eastern Empire, what we now call Byzantium, endured. From Constantinople, its emperors ruled for another 1,000 years, blending Roman governance with Greek philosophy and Christian theology. The flame of Rome continued to burn there, steady and bright, long after it had been extinguished in the West. But in the 5th century, the West grew darker. In 455, Rome was sacked again, this time by the Vandals. The word vandalism still carries that memory, of treasures destroyed, of beauty lost. The empire's last emperor, Romulus Augustulus, a child of barely 16, was deposed in 476 by a Germanic general named Odoacer. It was an ending so quiet that few even noticed. No final battle, no fiery ruin, only a soft transfer of power from one set of hands to another. The Western Roman Empire, which had ruled the known world for nearly 500 years, was no more. But history is never truly a story of endings, only of transformations. The people of Europe still lived among Roman roads, under Roman laws, speaking languages born from Latin. The Church preserved Roman books, Roman art, and Roman memory. Even the new kings called themselves imperator or Caesar, borrowing the titles of their fallen masters. In this way, Rome never completely died. It dissolved into the bloodstream of civilization, into every city that built an arch, every government that wrote a law, every thinker who asked how power might serve justice. And beyond the ruins, something else had survived. The idea that order, even fragile and fleeting, was worth striving for. The fall of Rome was not a sudden collapse, but a long surrender, not of courage, but of coherence. The empire had grown too vast, too complex, too dependent on the illusion of permanence. In the end, it fell not to an enemy, but to entropy, to the slow unraveling that claims all great things. And yet, it is from such ruins that renewal begins. The Middle Ages, often seen as a darkness after the light, were in truth the soil in which the seeds of a new world began to grow. Monks copied texts by candlelight, scholars debated the nature of God and reason, architects built cathedrals where once stood temples to Jupiter. The empire became a memory, but one that continued to whisper through the centuries. Rome, the poet said, was not built in a day, nor, it seems, did it vanish in one. Even now, when we speak of empire, of republic, of senate or citizen, we speak Roman words. We inherit their contradictions, ambition and order, pride and discipline, beauty and brutality. Perhaps that is why Rome still fascinates us. because it was not merely a civilization, but a mirror, reflecting what humanity can achieve at its greatest and how easily it can fall. And though the marble has crumbled and the legions are long gone, the echo remains. The echo of the eternal city. After the fall of the Western Empire, the eastern half, ruled from Constantinople, became the living memory of Rome. To its citizens, they were not Byzantines. That name would come centuries later. They called themselves Romaioi, Romans, heirs of Caesar and Augustus, guardians of the law and language that had once ruled the world. Constantinople was unlike any city that had ever existed. Perched on a narrow peninsula between Europe and Asia, it glittered with domes and towers, surrounded by the sea on 3 sides, and by walls so strong they would stand for 1,000 years. Within those walls, Roman traditions mingled with Greek learning and Christian faith, creating a civilization both ancient and new. When you picture it, imagine sunlight catching on the golden mosaics of its churches, merchants shouting in the crowded markets, and the scent of incense drifting through the air as monks chanted in vast cathedrals. This was no longer the Rome of emperors and togas, but a Christian empire, where crosses replaced eagles and prayers replaced sacrifices. In the 6th century, a man named Justinian rose to power, a man of immense ambition and intellect, determined to restore the glory of the old Roman world. He ruled from 527 to 565 CE, and in those decades, he reshaped the empire in ways that would echo for centuries. His reign began in turbulence. The city of Constantinople was vast, restless, and deeply divided. In 532, a riot broke out at the Hippodrome, the great arena where citizens gathered to watch chariot races. The factions, known as the Blues and the Greens, began by cheering for their teams, but ended by burning half the city. Thousands died in the chaos. Justinian considered fleeing, but his wife, the Empress Theodora, spoke with steel in her voice. "Royalty is a fine burial shroud," she said. "Better to die as an emperor than to live as a fugitive." He stayed. His general, Belisarius, crushed the rebellion, and Justinian began to rebuild. From the ashes rose one of the greatest architectural wonders ever created, the Hagia Sophia, the Church of Holy Wisdom. Its dome, vast and weightless, seemed to float upon light. For nearly 1,000 years, it would be the largest enclosed space in the world, a symbol of divine and imperial grandeur. Justinian was not content with beauty alone. He sought to recover the lost lands of the Western Empire. His armies reconquered North Africa from the Vandals, Italy from the Ostrogoths, and parts of Spain. For a moment, it seemed that Rome had risen again, an empire once more united by law, faith, and ambition. But conquest came at a cost. War drained the treasury, plague ravaged the population, and the new provinces proved difficult to hold. Still, Justinian's true legacy was not his empire of territory, but of law. He ordered his scholars to collect and refine centuries of Roman legal thought into a single body, the Corpus Juris Civilis, the body of civil law. It became the foundation of modern European legal systems, the blueprint for justice in countless nations yet to come. The Eastern Empire outlasted Justinian by nearly 1,000 years. It survived invasions, plagues, earthquakes, and religious schisms. Sometimes it was mighty and rich. Other times, it was reduced to little more than a single shining city. Yet through it all, it remained the beating heart of Roman continuity. Aritzasahern, scholars preserved ancient texts when the West had forgotten them. Its artisans blended Roman engineering with Greek art and Christian devotion. Its sailors carried silk and spices from the east, gold and glass from the west. And its emperors, crowned in golden halls, still called themselves Autocrator ton Romaion, Emperor of the Romans. In its golden age, the Byzantine Empire stood as a bridge between worlds, between antiquity and the Middle Ages, between classical knowledge and medieval faith. It produced thinkers like Photius and Michael Psellos, theologians like John of Damascus, and military minds that invented the terrifying weapon known as Greek fire, a burning liquid that could set the sea itself aflame. But empires, even the most enduring ones, are living things. They age, they change, and eventually, they fade. The Byzantines fought wars on endless fronts against Persians, Arabs, Bulgars, Crusaders, and Turks. Their power ebbed and flowed like the tide. And yet, for 1,000 years after the Western Empire had fallen, the Eastern one endured. When Charlemagne was crowned emperor in the West in the year 800, the Byzantine court scoffed. To them, there was only one empire, theirs, and only one Rome, reborn on the Bosporus. Still, history is never one line, but many. As the East preserved, the West reinvented. In the ruins of the old empire, new kingdoms arose. The Franks in France, the Anglo-Saxons in England, the Lombards in Italy. They spoke new tongues, but their laws, roads, and institutions all bore the imprint of Rome. The Latin Church became the guardian of what remained. Monks copied ancient manuscripts by candlelight. Cathedrals were built with arches and domes inspired by Roman engineering. And in universities, when they taught logic, ethics, or rhetoric, they taught it in Latin, the language of empire, long after the empire itself was gone. Even the very idea of Europe as a unified civilization, bound by law, reason, and faith, was a Roman inheritance. For centuries, rulers would look back to Rome as both a model and a warning, the dream of universal order and the danger of excess. By the time the Middle Ages dawned, Rome was no longer a political reality, but a memory, a symbol of what humanity could build and what it could lose. And yet, that memory remained alive, glowing softly through the centuries, like the embers of a great fire still warm beneath the ashes. When the Western Roman Empire fell, its stones were scattered, but not lost. Over the centuries, each fragment found a new home. Monks turned broken temples into monasteries. Scholars turned fading scrolls into lessons. Kings wrapped themselves in the titles and symbols of Caesar, seeking to inherit his majesty. Rome had vanished from the maps, yet it continued to live in the imagination. As the Middle Ages unfolded, the idea of Rome became both dream and blueprint. The Holy Roman Empire, founded by Charlemagne in the year 800, was not truly Roman nor truly holy, but it was an attempt to claim that lineage, to bind power to legacy. Its emperors were crowned by popes, wrapped in ceremony that echoed the old Caesars, even as their castles stood among forests rather than marble forums. The Church became the vessel that carried Rome's spirit forward. Its hierarchy mirrored the Roman bureaucracy. Its language was Latin, its law based on Roman precedents, its architecture filled with arches and domes. Even the rhythm of its prayers followed the structure of Roman oratory. To be educated in the Middle Ages was to think in Roman terms, to study Cicero's logic, Virgil's poetry, and Aristotle's ethics as preserved by Roman scribes. The monasteries of Europe were not merely places of worship, but libraries of the ancient world. Slowly, through centuries of darkness and light, those ideas began to awaken again. By the 14th century, in the cities of Italy, a quiet revolution began. Scholars and artists turned their gaze backward, to the ruins of Rome that still stood among them. They walked beneath crumbling aqueducts, studied inscriptions on broken columns, and imagined the grandeur that once was. They called their movement the Rinascimento, the Renaissance, the rebirth. Petrarch, one of the first humanists, climbed a mountain and wrote that he wished to see the world as the ancients did, not through superstition, but through reason and beauty. He gathered old manuscripts, letters, and poems, copying them by hand, breathing new life into the voices of Cicero and Seneca. He believed that by understanding Rome, humanity could rediscover itself. Soon, others followed. Artists like Brunelleschi studied the mathematics of Roman architecture, how domes balanced on arches, how proportions mirrored the harmony of nature. His masterpiece, the dome of Florence's cathedral, rose like a reborn pantheon, vast and weightless, a fusion of ancient geometry and Christian faith. Sculptors like Donatello and Michelangelo chiseled marble with the confidence of Romans, giving human form back its dignity. Their statues, serene yet powerful, echoed the grace of classical ideals. In their faces, you can see both the gods of antiquity and the hope of modern man. Writers and thinkers, too, looked to Rome for guidance. Niccolò Machiavelli, living in the turbulent politics of Florence, studied Livy's history of Rome and found in it lessons about power, order, and human nature. To him, the Republic of Rome was not a relic but a model, a living example of how virtue and pragmatism could coexist and how easily they could be lost. Even beyond Italy, Rome's shadow stretched. In France, England, Spain, and the German states, rulers adopted Roman imagery to express their strength. Capitals were adorned with columns and arches. Universities taught the Latin trivium and quadrivium. Grammar, rhetoric, logic, and the sciences of number, music, and motion. Disciplines rooted in Roman intellectual tradition. By the 15th century, the invention of the printing press spread these rediscovered ideas faster than ever before. The works of Cicero, Virgil, and Ovid were printed and read across Europe. The Latin tongue, though no longer spoken on the streets, became the common language of scholars. For the first time since antiquity, knowledge was free to flow again, unbound by geography. And then, as Europe looked outward, toward new oceans, new continents, it carried Rome with it. Explorers named their ships after Roman gods, built their capitals on grids modeled after Roman camps, and imagined their empires as heirs of the same destiny. The idea of empire itself, orderly, civilizing, expansive, was born again, though it would take new forms and bear new contradictions. The Renaissance was not merely the return of Rome's art or architecture. It was the revival of its spirit, its confidence in reason, its faith in human potential, its belief that the world could be understood and shaped by the mind. At its best, that spirit inspired genius. At its worst, it inspired conquest. The same roads that once carried Roman legions now led explorers across oceans, and later, colonizers into foreign lands. The echoes of empire were beautiful, but also dangerous. Reminders that power and enlightenment have always walked hand in hand, sometimes in harmony, sometimes in conflict. Still, through every transformation, one truth endured. Rome's greatest gift was not its armies, nor its monuments, but its capacity to endure in thought. To dream of Rome was to dream of order in chaos, of light in decline. Even as its marble turned to dust, its ideas endured: law, architecture, rhetoric, the very notion of civilization itself. And as Europe crossed from the Middle Ages into modernity, Rome became not just a memory, but a mirror in which each new age could see itself reflected. Its ambitions, its achievements, and its flaws. As the Renaissance gave way to the modern age, the idea of Rome did not fade. It transformed once more. It became the silent framework beneath Europe's awakening mind. Its ruins had taught men how to build again, its language how to reason, and its history how to dream both of greatness and of downfall. In the 16th and 17th centuries, the world grew wider. Maps that had once ended in dragons and sea monsters now stretched across oceans. Explorers sailed under banners that bore Roman eagles, naming new cities after old ones. New Rome, Nova Roma, Roma Nueva. The dream of empire had escaped the Mediterranean. But Rome's influence was not only political, it was intellectual. Its method, disciplined observation, logical structure, the belief that order could be discovered in chaos, became the foundation of science. Galileo studied motion through experiments that would have pleased the engineers of ancient Rome. Newton, centuries later, described universal laws that echoed the Roman belief in cosmic order, that the universe, like the empire, followed reason, not chance. Even as telescopes turned outward and microscopes inward, the Roman ideal persisted, the belief that knowledge should serve civilization. Libraries, museums, universities, all these were the heirs of the great Roman institutions where learning was once catalogued, copied, and debated. In the 18th century, the Enlightenment brought yet another rebirth of Rome, not as empire, but as reason itself. Philosophers like Montesquieu and Voltaire studied the Republic to understand liberty and law. They saw in Rome's rise and fall a mirror of their own societies, the dangers of corruption, the fragility of freedom, the tension between virtue and ambition. Montesquieu, in his Spirit of the Laws, praised Rome's system of checks and balances, its civic duty, its resistance to tyranny. From those reflections would grow the modern idea of democracy, a government not of kings, but of citizens bound by law. The very architecture of modern parliaments, with their domes and columns, recalls the Senate House of ancient times. In America, across the ocean, the founders of a new republic read Cicero as carefully as they read the Bible. They named their Senate after Rome's own, and built their capital city with marble monuments modeled after Roman temples. They saw themselves not as rebels, but as restorers of an ancient virtue, a second Rome, purified by liberty. Thomas Jefferson once wrote that he admired Cicero above all philosophers, and dreamed of a nation guided by his principles of justice and reason. In the Declaration of Independence, one can almost hear the echo of Roman rhetoric. The clarity, the logic, the moral gravity. Rome, once confined to the Mediterranean, had become the blueprint for the modern world. Its language shaped the law, its architecture framed the cities, its ideals guided revolutions. And yet, beneath this admiration, lay unease. The Enlightenment thinkers also knew how Rome had fallen, how pride had corrupted virtue, how wealth had eroded discipline, how empire had devoured its own ideals. They studied that fall not to mourn it, but to avoid repeating it. For every builder of a new Rome, there was a prophet of caution, a voice whispering that no civilization, however rational or noble, is immune to decay. Still, the dream endured. Artists, architects, and writers across Europe continued to resurrect Roman forms. The neoclassical movement, with its marble symmetry and moral clarity, turned every public building into a temple of reason. The British Museum, the U.S. Capitol, the Pantheon in Paris, all were new Romes, built not for gods, but for knowledge. Even in music and literature, the Roman sensibility returned. Composers sought harmony and balance. Poets wrote of virtue and duty. Painters portrayed statesmen and philosophers rather than saints. The Renaissance had reborn beauty. The Enlightenment sought to rebirth wisdom. But the 19th century brought a new twist in Rome's long afterlife. As Europe industrialized, nations looked to the empire not for moral inspiration, but for models of expansion and control. Empires arose once again: British, French, Spanish, Russian, each claiming to civilize the world as Rome once had. Railroads replaced roads, gunboats replaced legions, and yet the language of empire remained the same. The Romans had called their mission Pax Romana, the peace of Rome. The modern empires spoke of progress, of order, of enlightenment. But like the Romans, they often brought both civilization and suffering. The pattern repeated: ambition wrapped in idealism, glory shadowed by exploitation. Even in decline, Rome remained the teacher, sometimes of greatness, sometimes of folly. In the arts, meanwhile, the Romantic movement turned inward. Where the Enlightenment had admired Rome's discipline, the Romantics mourned its ruins. Painters like Turner and writers like Byron wandered among fallen columns, seeing in their broken majesty a metaphor for the fragility of human achievement. The Colosseum became not a monument to power, but to impermanence. Poets wrote of moss-covered stones, of marble crumbling under ivy, of beauty touched by time. In their eyes, Rome was no longer a model to imitate, but a memory to contemplate. And yet, even as ruins inspired melancholy, they also inspired hope. They reminded humanity that even when empires fall, art endures. The same hands that once built walls of conquest had also carved sculptures of tenderness and thought. The same civilization that had waged wars had also given us law, literature, and reason. The 20th century, too, could not escape Rome's shadow. Totalitarian leaders, obsessed with grandeur, borrowed its imagery: columns, eagles, legions marching in unison. But so did the architects of peace. The founders of the European Union built their vision on Rome's ancient ideal, civitas, the community of citizens united by law. The Treaty of Rome, signed in 1957, symbolically reborn that dream, not of empire, but of cooperation. What had once been conquest became dialogue. What had once been domination became unity. Rome's afterlife, then, is not a single story, but a conversation. Between power and principle, between order and freedom, between memory and renewal. Even today, its echo shapes our words. We call our leaders senators, our courts forums, our networks republics. We name our planets after Roman gods, our calendars after their months. The architecture of our cities, from Washington to Paris to Buenos Aires, still follows the Roman eye for symmetry and grandeur. Rome, it seems, never truly vanished. It lives in our minds as a language of greatness, a reminder that civilization is both fragile and resilient, both fleeting and eternal. And perhaps that is why, after 2,000 years, we still Return to it in thought, in art, in dreams. Because Rome was not just a city. It was, and is, an idea. An idea that the human mind can shape the world through reason, that law can tame chaos, that beauty can endure ruin, and even when empires crumble and time erases the marble, that idea remains, quiet, luminous, waiting. When we look at the modern world, we may think that Rome lies far behind us, buried beneath centuries of change, its emperors long forgotten, its legions turned to dust. But if we listen closely, we can still hear it breathing. Rome is all around us, not as stone or sword, but as thought. Our very words carry its voice. Half the languages of Europe, Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, Romanian, are its children, descended directly from Latin, the tongue of the empire. Even English, though born from Germanic roots, is filled with Roman echoes. Words like justice, liberty, virtue, reason, education, civilization, all trace their lineage back to Latin. When we speak of government, we speak Roman. When we write of beauty, we write Roman. When we argue with logic, we think Roman. Rome's alphabet became the alphabet of the Western world. Its calendar, refined by Julius Caesar and later corrected by Pope Gregory XIII, still measures our days. We live by Roman months, mark our years in Roman numerals, and celebrate the birth of a new year as they once did, with lights, wine, and reflection. Even our cities follow Roman design. The straight roads, the central squares, the domed halls, all descend from the Roman genius for order. The grid plan of a Roman castrum, a military camp, became the blueprint for countless towns across Europe and the Americas. Everywhere the Romans went, they left geometry behind, a logic of space that continues to guide us, quietly shaping how we move, how we build, how we live. The very idea of infrastructure, of connecting people through roads, aqueducts, and communication, is Roman at its core. The old saying, "all roads lead to Rome," was not just a boast. It was a description of a network so vast that you could travel from Britain to Egypt without losing the rhythm of the empire beneath your feet. Today, our highways, our digital networks, even our laws that cross borders, all follow the same dream: unity through connection. In a sense, the internet is the newest Roman road, a web of voices instead of stones, but built on the same desire to reach, to link, to share. The law, too, bears Rome's fingerprint. Every legal code in the Western world, from France's Napoleonic Code to Germany's Bürgerliches Gesetzbuch, owes something to Justinian's compilation, the Corpus Juris Civilis. Even beyond Europe, the principles of Roman law have traveled. The right to a fair trial, the presumption of innocence, the idea that no one is above the law. These are not simply rules. They are philosophies. Rome taught that justice was not vengeance, but balance. The harmony between duty and freedom. When you enter a courthouse and see its pillars rising in solemn symmetry, you are standing in the shadow of the Roman Forum, where the citizens once gathered to plead their cases under the open sky. In politics, too, the Roman heartbeat continues. The Senate, the Republic, the concept of checks and balances. These are ideas older than most nations, and yet still alive in every democracy today. The Romans believed that the state was a living organism, one that must be guided by reason and virtue. They called it the res publica, the public thing, the common good that belongs to everyone and to no one. When modern leaders speak of serving the public interest, of civic duty and law, They are unknowingly echoing the same principles that once shaped the Roman world. Even in the arts, the Roman spirit endures. Our architecture still dreams of its domes and arches. Our sculptures still seek the balance between realism and idealism. Our literature still admires the clarity of Virgil, the wit of Ovid, the wisdom of Seneca. When you see the Capitol in Washington, or the Louvre in Paris, or the courthouses that line the boulevards of London, when you walk beneath their marble columns and vaulted ceilings, you are walking through modern temples of Roman memory. Even our sense of time, of progress, of continuity is Roman. The Romans believed that history was not a cycle, as the Greeks did, but a story, a grand arc that begins, rises, and falls. It is this linear vision that shaped the Western mind, the belief that humanity moves forward through stages, from chaos to order, from ignorance to understanding. We inherited not only their roads and laws, but their faith in direction, their conviction that the world can be improved through reason, reform, and will. And yet, for all this grandeur, the truest legacy of Rome lies not in conquest, but in resilience. The empire fell, and yet its essence remained. Its stones were broken, but its spirit adapted, through monasteries, through universities, through the languages we speak and the thoughts we think. Perhaps that is the secret of all great civilizations. They do not die. They transform. In every age, humanity rediscovers Rome, not because we need its emperors, but because we recognize ourselves in its story. The rise and fall, the pride and the wisdom, the desire to build something lasting in the face of time. The Romans once built arches to honor victory. We build them now to honor memory. They built aqueducts to bring water. We build networks to bring knowledge. They dreamed of unity under law. We dream of unity through understanding, different materials, different tools, but the same longing, the same light in the human mind. Rome reminds us that civilizations are like people, born in struggle, grown through ambition, matured through wisdom, and remembered through what they leave behind. And so, in the quiet of night, when we speak of Rome, we are not just recalling a fallen empire. We are speaking of ourselves, of what it means to seek order in chaos, meaning in history, peace in knowledge. For in the end, Rome's greatest monument is not the Colosseum or the Pantheon. It is the enduring belief that reason can outlast ruin. As night falls over the story of Rome, imagine standing among its ruins. The air is still, touched by the faint scent of dust and stone. The moon glows against the broken columns, and for a moment you can almost hear the hum of a city that once ruled the world. Voices rise and fade. Merchants, poets, soldiers, dreamers, all gone now, yet somehow still here, their whispers caught in the marble. Rome was built on ambition, but sustained by thought. It was more than an empire of roads and laws. It was an empire of the mind. From its hills flowed the language of order, the rhythm of reason, the architecture of ideals. It reached from the banks of the Tiber to the farthest corners of imagination. And though the legions are gone, their discipline remains, not in weapons, but in the quiet structure of our thinking. Though its emperors are dust, their legacy continues, not in power, but in principle. And though the city itself has changed, its idea endures, not as marble, but as memory. The rise of Rome teaches us about strength. Its fall teaches us about humility. Together, they remind us that nothing, no empire, no person, no age, is eternal. And yet, in that impermanence, there is a strange kind of immortality. For everything that fades leaves behind a trace, a pattern, a lesson. Civilizations rise not to last forever, but to leave a mark. The Greeks gave us philosophy, the Egyptians, eternity, and Rome gave us the will to build, the courage to govern, and the dream that reason could shape the world. Every road we travel, every word we write, every law we obey, carries something of that ancient fire. It flickers in our institutions, in our art, in our collective memory, a torch passed from century to century. And perhaps that is why we return to Rome in thought, especially in the quiet hours of night. Because Rome is not just history, it is a reflection of the human soul. Disciplined yet restless, rational yet romantic, striving yet fragile. To study it is to study ourselves. Our hunger for greatness, our fear of decline, our endless search for balance between freedom and order, between chaos and peace. In every ruined arch, there is a lesson in endurance. In every fallen statue, a whisper of beauty that refuses to vanish. Rome's stones may crumble, but its voice still speaks, softly, like the echo of a teacher whose words linger long after the classroom is emptied. Even now, its influence surrounds us in ways we barely notice. In the symmetry of our buildings, in the cadence of our language, in the laws that protect us, and the stories that inspire us. Rome is not gone. It has become part of who we are. If you close your eyes, you can imagine walking through its ancient streets at dusk. The markets are quiet, the fountains still. The scent of olive oil and smoke drifts through the air. Somewhere, a scholar unrolls a scroll, tracing words written 2,000 years ago. Words that question, that reason, that endure. And in that moment you realize, the story of Rome is not about conquest. It is about continuity, about the way ideas survive even when empires fall. The marble may break, but the mind rebuilds. The torch passes on. The dream continues. Rome teaches us that wisdom is not found in victory, but in reflection. That greatness is not measured by how high we build, but by how deeply we understand. So as you drift towards sleep, let your thoughts wander through the ruins, through the halls of philosophers, the arches of architects, the libraries of scholars. Let the rhythm of history slow your breath. Let the weight of centuries soften into calm. For in every age, in every soul that seeks understanding, the light of Rome still glows. Faint, but steady. A reminder that we too are part of an unbroken chain of thinkers, dreamers, and builders. And though the world may change again and again, the spirit of inquiry, of reason, of creation, that eternal spark, will never fade. Sleep now under the same stars that once shone over the eternal city. The empire of thought still stands, and its story, like all great stories, has no end. Only quiet reflection and peace. Good night.